Then John will do the last 7, 15 minutes each. And we're going to kick it off with Andre Dekker. And I'm not going to introduce anyone because you have this beautiful handout that tells you who everyone is. And we only have 15 minutes, maximizing time. Oh.
Thank you for having me. I hope my voice holds up because I'm the one coughing from the air cough. So my name is Andre Dekker. I come from Maastricht in the Netherlands, and I'm going to talk a little bit mostly about Bob, actually, looking back in a little bit of history rewriting, I guess, and then perhaps talk a little bit about what we're doing at the moment. So the story that we have in Maastricht with Bob starts with something called the TFAF. And the TFAF stands for the European Fine Art Fair. And this is an art fair in Maastricht, in my hometown. And the good thing is, when you walk around this art fair, it's every year. It's one of the major art fairs. It's like walking in a museum, but you can say, "I'll take that. Can you wrap it for me?" Right? So you can just buy the Rembrandt that is sitting there. This was in 2008 when this TFAF was. And the building where the TFAF hold is about 100 meters, 300 feet from Maastro, our clinic. And the TFAF organization decided to sponsor a chair for the fair, an oncology chair. And in 2008, that was the iPhone 3. Nowadays, this is when what people understand, iPhone 3 came out. And in 2008, we were looking for a new TFAF chair. And Brad Wouters, who is now at UHN, the EVP of Research, suggested Bob Gillies, and expert in tumor metabolism, MRI, MRS. That's it. So we asked Bob to be the TFAF chair for 2008, and he luckily agreed. And the reason Bob was interested and we were interested because we were doing this kind of stuff. What we were trying to do is look at oxygen and hypoxia and trying to correlate that with images, because we just got a PET-CT scanner. And this is, for instance, a presentation at Astro of 2007. And you can see that we're thinking along the same lines in Maastricht when we were doing that. And so Bob came over in 2008, February, and you can see on this visit list that he met Dirk de Ruijsje, our radiation oncologist for lung. We had dinner, Philippe Lambert, myself, and Bob. And he also met one of our PhD students at that time. So Philippe and I mentored Hugo Aerts, who we also met at that time. And Hugo Aerts, he was working on response assessment. So what we're trying to do here is, with the PET-CT, we're looking at the pre-radiotherapy scan and looking at the post-radiotherapy scan in lung cancer. And we try to find out, where does the tumor recur? And what Hugo showed in his thesis, amongst others, and he published that as well, is something that, to be honest, I didn't understand, or I didn't know, that the tumor, what you're seeing here, is a pre-radiotherapy scan and a post-radiotherapy scan. And what is projected on the pre-radiotherapy scan is this blue region, which is the region where the tumor recurs, right, or doesn't go away. And until then, I've always assumed that radiotherapy was a game of not missing the tumor, right? And so the recurrence of the tumor must be where we don't irradiate. That's not true. The tumor recurs right smack in the middle of your high dose area, which you certainly have targeted. And this, I guess, goes back to about Gatenby's story that we don't really know which part of the tumor is radio resistant and which part of the tumor is radio sensitive. So that's what Hugo was doing at that time. And so we were both interested in this, and then we wrote the first grant together. U1 on the QAN network, and this is the PI is Bob Gatenby and Bob Gillies, which we call PI, and you can see our names on the bottom there. And so this, what we're trying to do is we will compare conventional clinical imaging tools, CT and CT PET. We're going to do it down to gene expression and to outcomes. And we're going to try and do specific therapeutic strategy using data from the Moffitt and from Maastro. So that's what started our journey, a fine art fair. The first workshop that I attended here in Moffitt was in November 2009. I think we just submitted or received the grant. It was up and coming. You can see Philippe, me, and Hugo there, and many other people. See, I think at least Bogetemi is there. I think other people you can recognize yourself here. So this was the first workshop that we had on radiomics. It was at Moffitt itself. You can see that this is at Moffitt on the right. There have been many workshops then. What was surprising in that first photo when I was looking at Bob's shoes is that he was wearing shoes. Because normally Bob would wear flip-flops or sandals to this meeting, right? So that was it. And I was happy to hear Matt saying that there was something like Bobism in Moffitt, right? Bobisms, things that Bob said. We had Bobology in Maastricht, which was born here in Clearwater because students, these guys were sitting, I think, with Eva at a barbecue she organized here in Tampa. And they were impressed by the Scientology building, which is close to here. And they were simply impressed by Bob. And so, you know, the first impression of Bob was that he was wearing flip-flop or sandals and that he was very great, and has been told many times, towards students in engaging with them. And so they were quite impressed, and they said, well, you know, these Americans start new religions, so we'll start our own. We'll call it Bobology. So I wasn't there at that barbecue, right? This was a Greek, a Croatian, and an Italian, and a Russian person doing this, right? Yeah, that's, I think, it's the start of a joy. But but when I was home, I continuously, you know, there was arguments saying, "Oh, this is against Bobology." I said, "What do you mean with that?" Right? So it was part of our lingo at that time. That was good. So we started, and this was already mentioned a few times, together with Moffitt, this idea of radiomics, and this is one paper. I mean, people often say that radiomics started with those two papers that Matt also showed, but that's not true, right? So these were the first papers that had radiomics in their title, right? But 2 years before that, the two Bobs and Sandy, amongst others, already wrote about radiomics in another paper. They just didn't put in the abstract. And so they said, well, you know, the quantitative analysis of the anatome can use to infer underlying molecular gene expression. This involves radiomics, which is the extraction of quantitative features from radiographic images. So Bob was the first one to publish on that, and others. He didn't invent the name radiomics. This was done by Samuel Blackman, you know, in a conversation. So what we did do is we probably did the first big study together on radiomics, and this is a Nature Communication paper that Hugo wrote with many others. And there are a few things that we did right in that paper. The first of all is that we used quite a bit of data, certainly for that time. And the other thing we did is all those things that you see there, we put on the TCIA, and they're still being used actively. I just got an email, I think 2 days ago, asking again more details about this long one data set. So it's being used heavily. We also use quite a bit of, you know, rationale to reduce the number of features. And we did a lot of validation, right? A lot of validation in other centers, external validation in other cancer sites. And that concluded into this picture where we could see that radiomics could predict survival. Now, my interest in this was always the data, right? So I'm a medical physicist by training, and much like Eduardo and other people, I'm worried about how can we get that data out of the clinic? How can we have enough data available for learning, and how can we have that at sufficient quality? And of course, imaging, the yellow bar, is the biggest part of data in a hospital, and so we really want to focus on that. But of course, the problem is that this data is so dispersed. The data is sitting around about 100,000 hospitals in the world, and so getting access to that data is one of the main issues that I was always involved in also subsequent grants with Moffitt and with Matt and others here. So what we said as well, you know, the sharing of data is extremely difficult, right? It's difficult because people don't have the resources, and we just were talking with Steve on this. So it takes a lot of resources to get good data. It takes a lot of will to share data. It takes a lot of ethical and legal and contract business to be done, and there are some technical issues. So this is a difficult thing. And so my research has always been about how can we do a different approach where we don't put all the data into one spot, but rather trying to bring the research to the data, right? How can we do a global effort to have the data globally available to do research? And to do that, you have to solve a number of challenges, right? If we want to work with Tianjin on their data, then we have to be able to send that Chinese center an application, a radiomics application that learns on their data and sends us back the results. And that has to be governed legally and technically by a lot of things, which we call track. So we have it about trains and tracks. So trains are your questions and track is the governance. That's not sufficient. If you send a train to us in Maastricht, that train won't speak Dutch. And so we have to have the data in Maastricht or in Shanghai or in Moffat in the state, where not just a human can read that data, but an application can read that data. And nowadays that is called fair data. And so fair data station trains and tracks is a metaphor for something called the personal health train, which we're now actively pursuing. So this is federated learning, was already discussed earlier. And so we repeated Hugo's study using the personal health train infrastructure, because at that time GDPR hit in Europe. So we're no longer allowed to have all that data in Maastricht. And so we had to federate that analysis and validate and redo that study. That was tremendously difficult to reproduce the original study because the software, of course, was no longer there. The data was improved, right? The donations were done. But in the end, we managed to reproduce that in a federated setting. And this has continued, right? So this is an active project where people like Tom Dilling, he's here, right? And others are involved here in Moffat, where we do this global federated deep learning effort, in this case for defining GTV in lung cancer scans. And of course, we can, once we have the ROI of the lung cancer, we can start doing, for instance, deep radiomics or classical radiomics studies with each other, all on the principle that all the data stays inside your hospital and never goes out. Now, to conclude, I have to say that I always felt there was something off with Bob, right? And I was talking to my bartender yesterday, what's the right word, right? Because sometimes the English fails me. So I said, he was like mischievous or facetious or something like that, right? There was something un-American about it, right? And one of the things that he said is, hey, Mr. 14. And this was, he called Hugo Mr. 14. And he called Hugo Mr. 14 because we have just developed a radiomics quality score in which the maximum was 36. And he thought Hugo was a 14. So he called him, hey, Mr. 14. And to one of my students who was talking about GANs, he blurted out, well, GANs save the world. I'm hearing all this about you, right? So I've always wondered what's wrong with this person, right? He's not a very, sane guy in his flip-flops and all that, right? And then I had dinner with his wife, Christine. So I'm happy that she's not here. And then I understood, right? Because he's half German, right? And for a Dutch person, that's a that made a lot of clarity, right? So when I was 17 days in 1974, I was 70 days old when the Dutch lost to the Germans in the World Cup. And this is a Wikipedia entry. This is a national trauma, right? If you talk to, it was born 1974, if you talk to a British person, what happened there, they would say, we lost to Germany in the World Cup. And the World Cup is again in 7 days, so this came up again, the mother of all defeats. And so we have difficulty with Germans for that reason. And the Germans also have difficulty with us because we are wearing orange jerseys because that's the king's color. And the Germans, they wear white jerseys because that's their king color. Before before the world wars, they had a king of Prussia, and so it was black and white. So they were black and white, and we wear orange, our colors. And so this was a billboard in 2016 when we failed to qualify for the European Cup. And what you're seeing here is the Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, one of the big, and they have this billboard there that says, "Well, for all the people that want to see orange during the European Cup, here's a new Netflix series." Can you see what the Germans do to us? So, and calling someone like Hugo Mr. 14 in all this aspect is also very dangerous because 14 is the number of our best footballer, Johan Cruyff. That's the number that he wore in this World Cup final. So, him being so interested in sport, I think he knew that. So he's trying to insult Hugo with that. It's even worse, right? So one of his daughters and so many of his grandchildren are called Müller for their last name, right? So the one that scored the winning goal in this World Cup final was someone called Der Bomber. That was his nickname. His real name was Gert Müller, right? So this is Bob just irritating me from from all that. And so this is what was off with Bob. And I do think that he knew what he was doing when he was telling us these things. So back to 2008. So right around the time that Bob was there was a big heist at the TFAP. And somebody stole this necklace, which was worth 2 million, or 1.8 at that time. It was done by 3 people from Mexico, very close to Arizona. And the 4th and the necklace got away, right? So, if I start patting Christine later tonight, or tomorrow morning, you probably know what I'm doing there. And this brings also nowadays myself back to the art fair again, because we're doing a project with federated learning and this privacy sensitive infrastructure that we built for health, not to find criminals that stole necklaces, but criminals are now using art in a different way. They are storing art in free ports at airports, and they're using that to pay each other without the government or the bank seeing that, right? And so we now just have submitted a new project where the valuation of those unique goods, either watches or art pieces in these free ports, with federated learning, we're going to find out who is doing these transactions and how art is being moved by criminals around the world. So you can see we're still back into fine art, and Bob is what started that. So thank you from the Maastricht side. These are just some students that have worked with Bob of the many we have, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. And next we have John Hazel from MD Anderson. Given the shortness in time, we might not have time for all questions, but at dinner tonight, make sure you ask all those.
Good. I get to follow up with Bob's real passion in sports.